All right. Hey, Felicia.
Hey, Brian.
How's it going?
Going okay.
Yeah,
Still in the middle of a bunch of things, but
yeah, yeah,
seeing some
yeah,
light.
yeah. So this is my friend Felicia, and I shouldn't even say friend. I should also say collaborator because what we're going to be talking about today is Game Changer, the game of activist tactics, which
What?
we made together. What? Look at
I
that.
did instructions and cards included. I hate it when a game doesn't come with instructions. We
I know,
really
right?
went above and beyond.
Order now. No. First, so we're gonna. This is the first in a very loosely named series, 3 questions for an activist, where we may ask more than 3 questions, but the goal will be to ask at least three. And Felicia is our first guest. And I thought it would be great to have you on because just your wealth of knowledge and also an awesome collaborator, and it was so fun to build this game, which we've just released. And so I thought we'd spend some time talking about that. But first, would you mind introducing yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are, the work you do, and how we came to collaborate.
Sure. So again, or as may be evidenced on the screen here, my name is Felicia Perez, and I'm currently living in Reno, Nevada. I'm originally from Southern California, specifically the city of Orange. So I lived in Los Angeles for as much time as I lived in the city of Orange. So it's always interesting to me how people describe where they're from based on where they're at or where they want to be or where their sort of like ancestors and family has been for so many years. So it's a bit complicated, but I'm in Nevada right now. And just a small PSA announcement, it's Nevada. Nevada,
Not
not
Nevada,
Nevada. Yeah. So
not
just wanted
not
to,
Navudu or
yeah,
Navy.
not Navudu, please, not Navudu.
Okay,
And
Nevada.
so thank you. And I used to be a high school history teacher for 12 years before moving to Nevada. And then prior to being a high school history teacher, I was a community organizer. And so moving to Nevada and leaving the K through 12 high school classroom, I went back into organizing and really just couldn't leave teaching, couldn't leave the idea of sharing power in a space and sharing information with one another. And so I went back into training, particularly around story-based strategy training and narrative work. And I find it to be very important for folks not just to learn new information, but to also practice engaging with that new information and sort of making it their own, and really sort of working with the new to really make it not so new anymore. So I very much so believe in learning to practice and to practice to learn. And so the idea of then integrating education or learning new ideas with play, with gaming, seems like the perfect match to really be able to not only engage, but have ongoing practice of something that is also fun, and exciting and collaborative in some way. So that's what I'm trying to do now. And that was the spirit behind the Game Changer game.
And us at Tessa, we just hate games so much. So it was just a terrible connection. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
That's really fantastic. And what you're saying about like people learn best by doing and sort of the gamification. I mean that's what we're all about, and that's why I was so excited about this collaboration when it first came to be. But so Game Changer, as we have it now here, for those who can see it,
Yes.
it's a beautiful card game. It's a quick, funny, fast card game about sort of using your radical imagination for activism and activist tactics. And we'll get to what radical imagination means in just a minute. But I want to just sort of talk about the origin story. When we first started talking about working on a game together, the game that came to be, Game Changer, it was very different, the initial concept. So can you just talk about like the origins, where it started, and how we sort of made that eventual transition to the game we have today?
Yeah. So oh gosh, I was just thinking when you and I started working on this, how long have you and I been working on just this piece?
Well, I think it was before the pandemic, if that helps contextualize anything.
Thank you. No, it does. So a year plus. A
What?
year
Yeah.
plus is when CSS and Tessa Collective came together to work on this game. And prior to that, it was about 5 years that we had initially thought about how do we make a game that is about two things. One, really focusing on the importance of knowing your audience. At the time I was working at the Center for Story-Based Strategy, and CSS, as it's also known, it has a bunch of, different sort of tenets to the work. And one of them is knowing that when you say my audience is the general public,
Mm.
or I want everybody to know about this, when you say I want everybody, that essentially you're saying I want nobody, because it's too broad, it's too big. We need to get very specific in who it is that we're trying to either change their mind, move them, have them, really be hit in the heart and the head and feel compelled to engage in some sort of action. And so, how do we do that? How do we get people to understand the importance of, an audience, not just in a political campaign, but in everyday life? And then also the second piece of what we were trying to do was to create a way in which people could practice making strategic choices,
Mm.
that not only am I going to think about my audience when I'm making something in terms of a story or a larger narrative campaign, but also what are my options and
Mm.
how is it that I engage in figuring out why this and not that, right? And key to it is audience, but also key is like, well, what do I even have, right? Like, what's in front of me? What can I make out of what I have? And so those were the two big sort of, motivating guides to wanting to come up with a game. And so if you add 5 plus a year and a half, we're looking at almost 7 years ago. So what was popping off in 2014? And basically what we have is two games that were really sort of in popularity at the time, and for a variety of age groups and a variety of cross-generational work. And those two games are Apples to Apples, really more of the cross-generational. They had a younger version where sort of the content was a little bit more accessible, but it was still something that you could play with your whole family across multiple generations. And then the game that wasn't so much so in that wheelhouse, but definitely was in the popular wheelhouse, also a card game, also about judges or a decider or audiences. And that would be Cards Against Humanity, which has a very particular audience that it
It
as a
does.
game is for, right?
Yes.
And
Yes,
so
it
these
does.
two games are card games. You don't need a whole board. You could take the cards with you. You can bring them to different gatherings and different homes and different spaces, at least at that time, in 2014, 2015, right? And it was a game that I was seeing people play. And on the one hand, I was like, why is this game, speaking particularly, I won't tell you which one, why is this game getting you to think about things that are so potentially offensive in a funny and entertainment way? But what we're seeing over and over again are some things that are pretty offensive. And I didn't like the repetition of seeing something offensive over and over again. Because the reality is, as an educator, as a trainer, I know and can speak to the fact that the more we see something, the more we like it. The more we see something, the more we can imagine ourselves doing it. And so we're learning all the time just in repetition. And so are those really the things that we want to really make a groove in and really have stick with us? On the other hand, you had Apples to Apples, where the content wasn't elaborative and potentially offensive, or maybe even not humorous, but it was something that was super accessible for everyone and had across generations. And what I was really doing at that time, and what is really central to some of the work at the Center for Story-Based Strategy, is how can we create something new by taking something that already exists and adding a very strategic narrative storytelling component to it, so that not only is it entertaining or fun or something to do that would be very exciting and engaging, but also that it's engaging and exciting and getting us to, again, repeat and see over and over again things that we do want to see. Like we do actually have the power to decide what it is that we're bombarded with, or what it is that we're learning, or how big or narrow a frame of our, interactions with the world is. And so if we could give people an alternative choice that is the same type of gameplay dynamic, but the content is very different. This is a game that we wanted to create, again, for our particular audience, which is folks who are new to organizing, direct action organizing, and folks who are interested in expanding their knowledge of what has been done and what could be done.
Great. That super in depth. And I want to just throw out there for those of you, maybe few, maybe more than we know, who don't really know how Apples to Apples or Cards Against Humanity work. It's essentially the same thing, right? You have one deck of cards, which is either a fill in the blank or a term or a word. In Apples to Apples, it's more innocent. Maybe it's fuzzy or something. In Cards Against Humanity, it's purposefully outrageous and offensive. And the core gameplay is the same. Is that all other players have a set of cards in their hand, and they try to put a card in the pile that they're trying to get the active judge of the round to say, that best describes fuzzy, or that's the best offensive or fill in the blank answer or whatever. And these games have had a lot of success and there's been a lot of different types of these games, and for a couple of reasons. One is, I think just that laugh out loud outrageousness, the ease of understanding. And I do think there is one really just clever game mechanic there, which you alluded to, which is, knowing your audience, knowing like, I'm going to save this card for when Felicia's the judge, because I know Felicia is going to go for this one.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so I think there was a real key lesson that you pulled out for Game Changer, which is a game about activist tactics that uses but builds off of that model. And we do some things different, but really hones in on the idea of knowing your audience. Is Brian, Brian, he's super into labor stuff. He's going to go for that general strike card.
Every time.
I know it.
Every time.
Yeah. But that's a really important part of activism and so I thought pulling that frame, really honing in on that mechanic for activism and radical imagination was a really brilliant idea. So actually, let's talk about that.
Sure.
This game is all, we say on the box itself and all the marketing materials and everything. This is a game about using your radical imagination, like, different activists imagining different situations. We've got a card here that says this is like a judge card. A video about blank is going to go viral for sure. And then players will put in their different answers from their answer cards, and so the idea is your radical imagination. So can you just describe what radical imagination is and why thought it was so important to make a game about that?
Right. So a lot of the work that the Center for Story-Based Strategy has really focused on in the last 10-12 years is about how do we go beyond just thinking about what is the best strategic choice right now and with what we have. How do we, and what we know, how do we also create a space for what is possible without any restraints? So many times when we think of what to do as a response or what to do as a new idea, we are stuck in really thinking about, well, how do we react to exactly what is right in front of us? And how do we make something, with the limited amount of people, the limited amount of time, and the limited amount of funding that we have, right? Like there's these constant things that sort of, anchor us, but sometimes an anchor can be so heavy that it actually pulls us down and doesn't allow us to actually do what is necessary for the moment. And so the idea of radical imagination is to say, well, let me take my constraints, let me take what I usually think of, and let me put them down for a second. And let me instead imagine that anything is possible and that I and we are capable of anything. And let me look around and see what that would look like. So instead of looking at things through the lens of what can I do with what we have, you're looking at things through the lens of what do I need to do in order to meet this exact moment? And what that usually looks like initially is that's impossible. That's outrageous. That would never work. And those kinds of thoughts and ideas are actually great, because if we lived in a world where we didn't imagine an alternative way, if we didn't imagine an alternative moment in which we could place ourselves in, then nothing would change. Change itself begins with one thing, and that is imagining what that change would look like. And so when we say radical imagination, we mean like, don't just think about it for 2 seconds. We mean like lean into it in your planning, lean into it for the day, the year, and to actually make space and bring community members together in order to have that happen. We tend to look at play and imagination and joy and having a good time as not real radical social change, right? But it is, because inherently taking a long line to wait to make your casting of your ballot a reality, instead of just making it a long line where you just have to wait, instead making it a dance party where you're then fed and you're nourished and you're there with your friends and family and it's a whole, event, is a very different way of looking at going to vote than I have to go stand in this line and it's horrible and it's painful and it's this thing, versus it's this inviting, wonderful community celebration moment that I want to go to. And that exact change and imagining a different way of thinking about voting and elections is dangerous. It's dangerous because it's powerful. And that danger and that powerfulness of it is why we have folks reacting in the country right now, wanting to make voting changes so that fun isn't a part of elections, so that joy and community isn't a part of elections, because it's dangerous. And so we need to see that as powerful as it is, and to, again, make time and space and create moments in which imagining a different world, imagining a different way in which we can interact with it is possible, and then figuring out how we actually make that inevitable. And so is that a game? Is that dancing? Is that taking the stakes that are very high and just, instead of saying we have to be cautious, instead saying we have to be cautious and what do we actually need to do to meet the moment? Because oftentimes when we look at the most incredible and most damaging changes that are more conservative and restricting, they're so outlandish, they're so bigger than life that we are like, this couldn't possibly work. And then it does. So we also need to learn from what's happening around us, that doing things the usual way is going to provide usual results. And we need super results at this moment.
Dang. That was awesome. And it makes me sort of think. There's this phrase that stuck with me. I was at a book reading for a book that was coming out at the time called Octavia's Brood. It was a book collection of people inspired, I think, by Octavia Butler and the sci-fi writer. And I don't remember who said it or in what context, but the quote itself stuck with me whoever controls our imagination controls our future. And
But wait, before you get to your favorite cards, and we can do that in just a second. I wanted to add, one of the things that happens when we are feeling the most scared, the most unresolved, the most under attack is we're human beings. We have a brain, we have a mind, and we naturally go to three things. And we all know these at some point in our lives, right? Fight, flight, or freeze.
Right.
Nowhere in those three did I say imagination,
Right.
right? So it's
Right.
so it's we're going to fight, we're going to run away, or we're going to freeze.
Yeah.
And that is inherently exactly why we need to get into radical imagination in those kinds of situations and times, because
Yeah.
we can't possibly imagine an alternative from those three. And that's exactly what we need in that moment. Like thinking back to the last year with COVID, the thing that initially came up at the beginning of it was, I can't wait for that moment when this is over. So, because we were already radically imagining a moment where it was beyond us. And as more time went by, it became more and more challenging and harder to imagine the other side, what another side of sheltering in place could be like. And now, feeling more hopeful, having more time to look at possibly some positive outcomes, there are many of us hesitantly, right, imagining what in a few months or in another year life could look like. But again, in that moment of the most fear and the most constriction of power and empowerment, we usually stop imagining. That is inherently one of the tools to sort of, help us stay in our places. And so the idea of radical imagination is understanding that that happens, A, and B, that our imagination is a muscle. And if it is not used, if it is not built upon, if it is something that we only imagine that it's useful for young children, then we're not in the ability to flex it when needed. And if you think about it, think about multiple generations. We have young people who we encourage to imagine, you can do anything. You could do that someday. You could be that someday. And then you look to our elders in our community and they say things like, I never could have imagined that this is the world we would be in. So what does that tell us? That somewhere along the way, the imagination part is the thing that kind of gets taken away from us, that isn't encouraged anymore as we get older. And why is that? Because we have to sort of fit into this way that systemically things work to imagine new things. Why would we go to work every day? Why would we go to school every day if you could imagine all these other things? So we figure, why don't we embed it as a fabric into everything, that both where you learn, where you work, where you go train, where you exercise, where you are just outside enjoying the earth and the elements and your connection to one another, and how can we continue to foster the imagination and to see that as just as important as wind, air, and earth is our imagining of ourselves in the world.
I want that on a shirt. I don't know if it'd fit, but I want that on a shirt.
It's a very short fonted
Yeah.
shirt there. So your favorite cards, you were about to say.
All right, welcome back from commercial break. Felicia, you talked a lot about radical imagination and the importance of that, and I said I wanted that whole thing on a shirt, and it's a small font shirt, but
you could say it in three ways. One, radical imagination is what we do together versus what we do apart. Radical imagination is rooted in place, right? It's very particular to, again, from neighborhood to watershed to the earth itself. Like, we are rooted in place. And that radical imagination is time travel. It allows us to look back and it allows us to look to the future. And that, to your point earlier about talking about Octavia's Brood, right? This amazing, Black feminist sci-fi writer, Octavia Butler, part of that work is about time travel. Sci-fi allows us to really imagine not only the future, but to ground that in a historical moment as well. As we know that so much radical imagination is actually how we ancestrally got to still be here, right? In terms of imagining different things and making those true and happen. So your favorite cards, Brian, are?
So let's talk about some of our favorite cards in the game, how we translate these ideas that you just talked about. And so for folks, there are two types of cards in the game. There's the golden deck, that's GOALDEN, so mix of goal and they're golden deck. And these are the cards that on your turn, when you're the decider, you're saying, you know, this is what I want people to throw their answers into. And so, you know, one of my favorites, just had it, is
Yes, these are the prompt cards that
prompt
the
cards.
decider or
Yes.
judge would select looking at that lens.
So I really like this card, which is, what is the boldest idea in my backpack of organizer tactics, even if it's risky? I like this one because people were, well, you know, sometimes they have the ones where like, I don't know if I'd do this in real life, but, you know,
Yes,
throw out the answer, right? And so
yes.
and that's the whole idea of radical imagination. And then there's you know, I really like this one as well. Blank will get people in their 20s to join our cause, just because I think it can show a generational difference in what people think people in their 20s will get excited about.
Yes,
So,
yes. Again,
and,
you know, you could go even more specific.
Yeah.
You could say people in their 20s who are not currently in college, who have a you know, under 15 an hour job. You know, like you could get super specific, but this is at least giving us a taste of what that kind of specificity does in terms of what folks might select. So that is the golden deck.
Let me throw out one more.
Just, what else you got?
I also like nowadays this card, right? It says, nowadays every activist is into blank. Just because I think when I've played, it's allowed a moment for people to poke fun at ourselves, have a little bit of levity, be like, everyone's into sabotage, or everyone's into, you know, a general strike, or everyone's into going door to door knocking, whatever. And so this one is, I think, in my plays, have allowed for that sort of like poking fun at.
And even though that one's super general, right? Like nowadays everyone's into, like who you'd be playing this with. Like these are the people who are into this, right? Like when you're thinking about people in their 20s, you're thinking about who in our circle of work, in our circle of life, in our community, you know. So even as the cards themselves, the prompt cards might be very specific or very general, again, the game itself, as you play it, those who are familiar with other kinds of games like this or who already have this game, that's sort of what it does, right? Like it really brings whoever is playing it into the very specific space that we are talking about with those prompts. So these are the other cards that are the main cards of the deck. These are the power deck, and they are black, like the Cards Against Humanity cards, on purpose. One, you could maybe mix all of these games together if you wanted to. And so this is really something that you could adapt, but also because we wanted deliberately for people to have to say, oh, can you hand me one of the black power cards? Like we wanted folks to say golden and say goal over and over again. We wanted folks, if they were going to say anything about power, black power, we didn't want these to be white cards. And we also didn't want these, we thought about like in terms of branding and color that these should be green cards, but we also didn't want people to be repeating green card, green card, green card in terms of like what's associated with all these different kinds of things. And so my favorite black power cards are, there's a couple of categories. One is just the cards that have names of objects that have been really transformed historically or in a more recent history. You've got duct tape. Okay, the idea that duct tape is at all in an organizing strategy is, this tells you about like what is actually used on the ground versus the theory. Like in theory, duct tape shouldn't be in here, but in reality it is, because we oftentimes need something to be strong, to secure, to repair something.
Can I just real quick, just because I think this alludes to the point of radical imagine. We had a whole discussion, and I was like, duct tape, no, don't put it in here. And I was like, that doesn't make any sense. And you were like, and you were like, here's all the way that duct tape is used for activism. And I was like, my radical imagination is expanded. I had no idea.
You need to repair your shoes? Duct tape.
Yeah, right. And so
We
I was
need,
like,
yeah.
and I was like, no, we need to like put an actual activist tactic in here. And you were like, here's where duct tape would work on this card, on this card. And I was
Yes,
like,
this is an
all right.
actual activist tactic. So
Yeah.
is saran wrap, right? And so underneath in the world's smallest font,
Yeah.
it actually gives you the details, because every single one of the items in the Black Power cards is real in
Right.
terms of it has really been used and utilized by activists and direct action organizers. So the saran wrap came from our friends in Hong Kong. Protesters began using saran wrap to cover their arms and legs so that their skin would be protected from chemicals being used to disperse the crowd, right? So this is also about taking something that maybe that wasn't its original intention of utility, of use, but it has usefulness in so many other spaces. That's where the radical imagination part comes. An umbrella, it isn't just used to shade in terms of like those protests where they deliberately are out in the beating sunshine, where they expect folks to not be there. Well, our signs, our protest signs are now on the umbrellas and they're providing shade, or it's rainy, or again, chemicals are being used to disperse a crowd. This umbrella, you know, in Spanish, an umbrella is called a paraguas or a parasol, right? And para means to stop. So it's to stop the sun or to stop water. But this could clearly be used as an umbrella to block many other things. Providing face masks, who knew that this would both be a climate justice tactic and a COVID health tactic?
Right.
Creating a new state recognized holiday. Some folks might say this is the weakest card, creating a new state recognized holiday. And then the reality is, look at most of our holidays. Somebody made them. And those holidays let us know what's important and what's valuable to us as a society. And so it's important for us to have some say in what that is. Juneteenth and Cesar Chavez Day, these were days that were not holidays initially. A birth strike. You see this happening right now with generations of people over and over again for a few years now saying, I don't think I want to have children right now. What is that a response to? And how can that actually be leveraged in a particular way? And then finally, another favorite is an audio recording. And that's because so many times when we think about organizing tactics, we think about their physicality and not how sometimes what we need to wake up is actually our ears and our minds of what we're hearing around us versus what we're only seeing in front of us. Those are my faves.
Love it. I also just want to throw out, there's also some like big ones out. There's like, you know, laying down in front of a bulldozer. There's delivering free food and essential goods door to door. There's shutting down a port. There's pieing your opponent in the face while the cameras are rolling. So this game,
I've also got blocking the cops from evicting families from their homes.
Right. I mean, you know, this, you know, a kissing. This game just has this when you match there's something like 250 of these black cards and something like 50 of these golden cards, and there's just so many ways to mix and match and imagine these, like, you know, a video about blank is going to go viral for sure. A kissing, you know, pieing your opponent in the face while cameras are rolling, shutting down the port, you know, photobombing a politician, you know, duct tape, you know. So there's just so many like, wait, like, okay, we throw those in, and who's judging it, right? If Brian's judging it, oh yeah, man, I'm totally choosing the shutting down the port one. But you know, if Felicia is, you know, so
I'm going to go with duct tape. Clearly,
yeah,
just
exactly.
give me the duct tape.
Right. So about knowing your audience, that radical imagination. I just love the opportunities that when I've at least played this game for people to be like, no, but imagine this happened, da, 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 da. And there's so much like conversation and like, oh, I could totally see that happening. And so that's what I really love about how this game really brings out that radical imagination.
I played this game with my mother, who's in her mid to late 70s, my sister, who's 50, and my two nieces, who are 20 and 11. Okay, so this was the gamut of generations. And it went from my mom saying, yeah, no, they did that once, to my youngest niece, who's 11, saying, I don't even know what this is, to the 20-year-old niece saying, okay, remember blah, 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 it's like that, right? So there's this really intense education and experience that individuals who play this game have comes in. So it ends up being that this game isn't just about what's on these cards, but also what's in the experience and the mind, imagination, or reality of its players to help explain to one another its possibility or that it has already happened. And that's really the key part to that 250, deck of the Black Power cards. That is 250 tactics that people have used and deployed over centuries of direct action organizing, not just in the United States, but internationally as well. So in terms of who this game can be for, even just new organizations that are trying to build up their organizing capacity, young folks who are learning about movement history and trying to learn about what tactics were even used at different times. There's so much information and education in these cards. And then again, being able to play it and interact with them allows that education to become in practice and in theory and in its radical imagination of what is possible based on what has already happened, but changing up the scenario of where it could happen again.
Game changer, the game of activist tactics. Felicia, thank you so much for taking the time to talk and to work with me on this game.
Oh, Brian, thank you for the opportunity.
I'm so excited with how it came out. It's a small box, but there's a lot of game in this, and it's a lot of fun, a lot of opportunity for conversation, laughter, imagination. You can get it on our website, tessacollective.com, and I'll drop a link down there. But yeah, and Felicia, where can people find out more about the work you're doing?
You can also buy Game Changer from the website feliciaperez.com. Please come give us a visit, find out about the other things that I'm also working on and up to these days.
Digital high five. Boom. See you later.
Thanks.